Well, hi there, I'm Dr. Tom Ulrich, and I like to talk about leadership and engineering. Well, hey, sometimes though, I like to talk about management. Okay, that's totally a stretch. I don't really like it. But here's one thing there is a topic near and dear to my heart that actually kind of lives at the intersection of leadership and management. And that topic is Scrum. I've done conferences where one of my PowerPoint slides will be usually I talk exclusively about leadership, and when it comes to management, I only say two words. And then the slide just has two words. It says use Scrum. All right, so what I'm going to do though, because this is a topic I keep kind of comes up a lot talking with engineers I meet, is I'm going to produce a series of videos that talk about, give you a little bit of orientation to what is Scrum. Now, before we continue, I do want to take a moment to explain two very, very bizarre phenomena. The first is I'm in Southern California, and what we have is this gray stuff in the sky. So the sun seems to be gone. That's very frightening for us. And the temperature, it's December 30th right now, and the temperature is absolutely freezing to the point that I have to wear a t-shirt today. I can still get away with short sleeves, but this is about as cold as it gets. Now, the other strange phenomena, if you look right there, and it was actually in one of my other videos, kind of mysteriously, right above there's like a wind chill, a wind chime, and there's like this little yellow weight that sort of hangs and makes the thing work, and it's kind of translucent, so you'll see this UFO-like yellow thing kind of go, because as it turns, it comes and goes. So just to not freak out, we haven't been taken over by aliens. That's just Kathy's wind chime. At any rate, so here we are in the dead of winter, and what I want to say in this video is do some introductory, make some introductory comments. Now, the first thing to know about Scrum is, well, what does it stand for? I mean, clearly this is an acronym like scuba, radar, or something. No, it's not. It's actually a term taken from the sport of rugby. Yep, I'm with you. Still don't know what rugby is, but it looks pretty rough. At any rate, apparently what they do is they have this formation where everybody sort of locks their arms and they make kind of a wedge, and they do, I don't know if they call it hiking or not, but somehow the play begins with people in a scrum and they sort of push. Um, Any rate, so the term comes from rugby. It's not an acronym. Doesn't The letters don't mean anything. The second thing is, a lot of times, in fact, we just recently hired a director at Tandem. When the person was interviewing, uh, the candidate kept saying, they kept using Scrum and Agile interchangeably, and I finally said, so what is the relationship between Scrum and Agile? The answer I was given was, well, those are synonyms, and they're not. So Agile is a family of methodologies, one of which is Scrum. Now, it's confusing because at Tandem, and I'm sure other companies too, we have some version control software called Agile. It kind of, it's like your formal documentation thing, quality systems and all that. And that's something entirely different. I don't know why they call that Agile, but I can tell you, the methodologies of Agile is a family, and Scrum is one example of an Agile methodology. In case you're scoring at home, you can, well, what are the other ones? Well, there's extreme programming. That's an Agile methodology. Lean is generally considered an Agile methodology. Kanban is generally considered an Agile methodology. I think I would break out Agile estimating and call it as its own standalone methodology. But the point is Agile is sort of a mind frame and a general mindset and approach, whereas Scrum is one particular methodology. Now, another thing you'll see is a lot of times the discussion of Scrum will devolve into A-B kind of conversation. And it'll go something like this: do we use Scrum or do we use Waterfall? And there's a lot of nonsense. But anyway, there's sort of this mind frame that they're totally different and they're competing. And if things are serious, you could have to use Waterfall. And If they're not serious, then you can use Scrum or some nonsense like that. And that really is false. In fact, to really put some emphasis on that, you'll notice in the FDA documents, the software documents, they do not say you have to use Waterfall. They explicitly say you don't have to use Waterfall. What they say is you have to tell us what you're doing. Now that sounds like, okay, do they mean it? Well, probably around 2011, 2012, somewhere around there. I was at one of these conferences, these AMI conferences. It's something like IEEE, but for medical devices. Anyway, there's a conference they hosted, and they got some speakers from FDA to come speak, and one of the speakers was John Murray. Now, FDA, you can kind of think of it as having two pieces. The one piece is sort of pre-market approval, so there's a part of FDA that's answering the question, can I sell this? The other half of FDA is sort of the army of auditors. They're the ones who look at what you wrote and asking questions like, are you following this? Are you following the law? And at the time, John Murray was the head guy for the auditor side. So, I mean, arguably was the number 2 or number 3 guy at FDA when he said the following thing. He said, look, they come in and they do these audits. And what they're really tired of is hearing companies say they use Waterfall. And he went on to explain is, we all know Waterfall doesn't work. We all know, therefore, you're not actually using it. And when we go to do audit, everybody seems to be saying, I'm using Waterfall. And then when they look at the actually doing, it's not Waterfall. And what he came out and said, look, you don't have to use Waterfall. And what we really want is for you to stop saying you're using it unless you actually are. Now, as a follow-on to that, it was one of these conferences where they gave us lunch, and the speaker sitting around. I ended up sitting next to John at lunch, and I had a chance to ask him a few follow-on questions, and I am absolutely convinced that he would give you the what for if you said to him, will you guys require us to use Waterfall? They don't, and they are of a mind that for all but the most rote implementations, Waterfall is not appropriate. Okay, now before I continue this bit, there'll be some of you who are like, so what's Waterfall? So this is Waterfall. So what the idea is you come up, I've numbered them 1, 2, 3, 4. You come up with a process where you think there's some discrete things you need to do. And it's not just that you say, well, we'll do activity 1, and then activity 2, and then activity 3, and then activity 4. And by the way, that's where the name comes from. See how it kind of looks like a waterfall, like the water flowing down these steps. But key thing of Waterfall is not only do you identify these steps, but you militantly enforce them. And so you have rules like, thou shalt not do anything in step 2 until everything in step 1 is complete. And thou shalt not do anything in step 3 until everything in steps 1 and 2 are complete, and so on. So you sort of militantly. Now, in a different video, I'll talk about the history and how we got to there. And the truth is, Waterfall in context in the late 70s and early 80s was actually a very positive step forward, because you had this kind of this wild west thing that was insane. But so the attempt to do things in order was a good thing. But over time, like so many good ideas, it started out being helpful, and now it's this baggage that we all carry around. And then in terms of what the steps are, typically step 1 will be something like define the requirements. And so say, okay, before you write any software, you need to figure out what the software is supposed to do. And conceptually, that is a very good idea. And then step 2 would be, okay, before you design any software, you should, or before you write any code, you should figure out how you're going to write the code. So you sort of architect it, design it, kind of think about, okay, there'll be these modules and those modules. And inevitably, this step design involves drawing circles and squares and lines and whatever method. Occasionally, you'll meet somebody who's convinced there's one and only one right way to do that, and that's just complete nonsense, I think. The value is using some method, any method, whether it's crayons or whether it's all text or whatever, to just get your thoughts clear before you start coding. The next step then is coding. You can't start that till you've got your requirements, till you've got your design, and then you code, and the final step is testing, and you don't do that until, Waterfall, right? So it makes for nice theory, but here's the problem that everybody who's ever written software professionally knows. Here's the problem. You can't understand the details without understanding the big picture. You can't understand the big picture without understanding the details. Now, one implication of that is, we have this theory that, I can write all the requirements for all the device right up front. Everybody who's ever tried that, as soon as you start to design it, you write all the requirements, you get them formally released in Rev A and can't change it, and then you start to design it and you see everything in a new light and you realize, that actually is logically inconsistent, it doesn't make sense. So the point is, as soon as you start to use the requirements to do the next task, you find all the defects from the previous step. You don't find the requirements problems until you start doing the design. You realize, yeah, that's not right. I had a professor, Paul Arthur, at UC Irvine. He used to like to say, design is an iterative process, and that's exactly what we have here. Is as you go further and further into the details, you learn more about the big picture. And so this idea that you can sort of act at this linear descent into detail, it just doesn't match the human experience. At any rate, so you would say, okay, here's the requirements, then we'll do design, and okay, now that we've got the design, we'll write the code. And as soon as you start to write the code, you realize, well, the design won't work because I wasn't thinking about this. And by the way, also the requirements are wrong. So every time you use these things, and then afterwards you test it, and then when you test it, you realize the code's wrong, the design's wrong, and the requirements are wrong. And so the whole thing just evolved into kind of just there was value in saying, we ought to write a requirement down, we ought to design it, we ought to code it and test it, we ought to do these things. And in fact, Scrum actually is consistent with that in only one sense. What you would say in Scrum is, in each time box, so let's say we're going to have a 4-week sprint, we will pick a feature, and for that feature and that feature alone, we will define the requirements, do the design, write the code, and test it all in that. Now, there's no fair saying, in this sprint we write the requirements, next sprint we do the design, because see, then it's sequential again. What you do is you all at the same time is that when you're at the end of the time box, you say, look, I have a written requirement, I have a written design, I have the code, and I have tests that prove that all three of the above are correct and appropriate. All right, so one final comment I'd make on Scrum is that Scrum is intended to be a lightweight process. Now, what the deal there is, if you ever worked in a place that is attempting to be Waterfall, attempting to take process seriously, and they're using, especially if they're using Microsoft Project, what you discover is you need one or more people full-time to interact with Microsoft Project. So you've got 10 engineers, you decide to use Project, you realize you lose 1 or 2 of them to just running Project, and it's so burdensome. Back in the day, it was all paper. You would have whole conference rooms with all these huge pieces of paper on them and all these little boxes. This has to be done in this, and then one thing would change, and hundreds of boxes would change, and it becomes this full-time job of constantly revising your estimates. And from a leadership perspective, the real problem is nobody actually doing the work. I've yet to meet anybody doing the work who thinks that adds value. It's just like, okay, we got to do it because management has a right to know where we're at, and so it's kind of a tracking thing. But by and large, it demotivates people, it annoys people, and it's really frustrating because you lose people who could be helping with the product. You lose them to just operating Microsoft Project. And in the process, their reality becomes Project, and they start to think as if, they forget that Project is a representation of what's going on, but it's somewhat something of a concoction. At any rate, so Scrum was created as a backlash to that, of saying enough with the heavy project, process. The Microsoft Project and all the things that come with it have distracted the team from focusing on the problem, like in our case, making a pump to give people with type 1 diabetes insulin appropriately, to worrying about schedules. That's bad. We have to have schedules. Yes, we have to hold ourselves accountable. Yes, of course. We have to give management visibility. But the question was there a way to provide accountability? Was there a way to provide visibility? Was there a way to sort of organize who's doing what without having so much burdensome stuff we have to do, where we spend all this time doing things that we don't really sense, that we can plainly see don't add value to the product. And one answer people came up with is, yes, there is, and we're going to call it Scrum. At any rate, I'm Dr. Tom Ulrich. I like to talk about leadership and engineering. If you want to see more videos on leadership or on Scrum or whatnot, you can go to my website, tomulrichconsulting.com. If you're on YouTube, you can actually search on Dr. Tom Ulrich. That seems to work. I keep hoping that the moniker engineering leadership guy will get to me. If you do type that, you'll get like every fifth one is me, so that doesn't quite work yet. Maybe someday, if you like and if you subscribe, maybe that'll become a reality. Anyway, but if you give me a like, hey, and if you have a question or comment, I'll respond to them. If you look at how many views there are, it isn't like there's 100,000 people watching these things, so I totally have time to respond to your comment. Anyway, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.